This is Truth Be Told.
That not only are there reptilians here,
new evidence of UFO fleets.
We were close to nuclear war.
To help you transform so that you can live your highest truth.
We're not being told just because we're not ready for it.
Geostations of frequency, vibrational.
I was a homicide detective with LAPD.
UFOs increase. Visitations. Being the origin of humanity. But what was before humanity? Today we have back with us Bernie Taylor talking about the Netflix series Unknown Cave of Bones, where a paleoanthropologist finds the world's oldest graveyard, and it's not human. So today we're going to be discussing what these species were, or are they cousins of Homo sapiens? I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please welcome back to the Truth Be Told studios, Bernie Taylor.
Tony, thank you for having me on the program again. I believe it's my third time.
I know it.
What amazes me most about this program is you are a really good-looking guy, and I say this as a entirely straight person, so that's a compliment.
Well, thank you. Either that or you have really bad cataracts. I don't know, but but I appreciate that. I don't hear that often enough, damn it. You know, when you hit 54 years old, you know, you don't hear it as much as you used to.
People out there in audio podcast land, this is the show to tune in on YouTube, not just because Tony's a really good-looking guy, but we're going to do something special.
Well, before we get started, I did get to watch majority of the Netflix series. Very interesting. I'm glad you brought this to my attention because honestly, it kind of bypassed me. But also, I wanted to get your take on something that I saw in the news the other day. And the title is 300,000-year-old skull found in China, unlike any early human seen before. Have you heard about that?
Yes. I did, but I did not study the question.
Well, then
so I'm not the right person to answer it at this time on this day.
I was going to say we'll have to have you back because that caught my eye when we booked this, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is even because kind of relating to what we're talking about today. So, but please take it away and please tell us what's going on. This is kind of breaking news in our line of work we do.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to go back to early June. We're going to step back into so first thing you need to enable your share.
All right, let me do that. I can do that for you. I'm going to make you like
I'm a host now, right? Co-host.
Co-host, yeah. You're my co-host for today.
It's like being promoted of sorts.
Well, you are. And, third time you get that right.
Absolutely. So we're going to go back to early June of this year. Okay. In early June of this year, there was huge news, and when I say huge news, it was all over the place. It was on CNN, it was on ABC, it was on the Hong Kong Daily. Everybody had this news across their desk in both the print media, the online media, and even NBC interviewed these people. And the news was that Homo Naledi cave in South Africa, discoveries upend that we know about being human, which was the Wall Street Journal, headline. And to put this into context, there's a cave in South Africa in this region called the Cradle of Humanity, and there have been many we'll call them pre-modern humans that were found in there. And I'm not an expert on all those pre-hominid humans, but one of them is called Homo Naledi. And Homo Naledi lived between 230 to 220, 30 to 330 or so thousand years ago. And Homo Naledi emerged as a new species about 2012, and completely accidental. Okay. Well, it was, and they were first, they weren't sure what it was, and then they decided they're going to name it this Homo Naledi, and it totally changed the concept of modern humans, because we thought, in fact, these archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, thought something like this could only exist a million years ago, and it turns to
Right.
be just over 200,000 years ago, which is really strange. So this person, Homo Naledi, walked with modern humans. Okay. We knew who they were. They knew who we were. There's no evidence that we interbred. So this came like really out of the dark. Well, in June of this year, the media was actually stimulated by a press release, or triggered by a press release that came out by two papers in this, we'll call it as a peer reviewed journal. You've probably never heard of that before, because freaking I never heard about it before either. Okay. And there are three papers, and the two main papers said that they made cave art, engravings, and the second was that they buried their dead.
Wow.
Now, I have absolutely no opinion on the burying of the dead, or this being a crypt that people drop their dead into. I have no issue with that at all, but a lot of archaeologists do. But my area is really in this in the cave art.
Right.
And these archaeologists actually put this together, because they put, well, Homo Naledi made this cave art over where they bury their dead. Therefore, they believe in the spirituality, and they believe in an afterlife. So you can just imagine across the screen where people were on this one. You sort of evangelical types, or like, we're the center of the universe.
Right.
And then you got the mainstream archaeologists like, whoa,
Right.
who's talking about God here now, right? So we're talking pretty controversial stuff. And what even made it more controversial is the so-called pre-peer reviewed process. Okay, and to say what the peer review means, based on the papers, the actual name from this pre-peer review journal, peer review is the journal editors take advice from various experts called referees who have assessed the paper and may identify weaknesses in its assumptions, methods, and conclusions. Peer review doesn't mean it's true. It means that some experts in the field, with their own baggage, have made a judgment one way or the other. Well, these guys released this pre-peer reviewed papers to the media and press releases as if it was fact. And so again, you have the mainstream media just like, whoa, we follow this scientific process. And then you have people like Graham Hancock and friends like, hey, this is all cool with us, right?
Right.
And I'm actually not on either side of that, because I'm not the mainstream, and I'm not the alternative. I have kind of my own path going on here. But it was startling, to say the least, to have the pre-peer reviewed paper discussed on ABC News, and the mainstream media, scientific community just absolutely furious about the whole thing. Well, it did a few weeks later. It did was released by a so-called peer-reviewed journal, but it wasn't released that it passed. 10 out of 10 for the two papers. 10 out of 10 gave it a thumbs down. so the mainstream scientific community, which was saying this, you don't release this stuff until it's actually other people have actually had an opinion on it, or even looked at what you did right or wrong, because you embarrass us in front of everybody. And the major players was Lee Berger from Witwatersrand in South Africa University, Augustin Fuentes, who's a really cool guy. If you see him, he might be a guy getting your show, because he's like the cool anthropologist.
That sounds cool.
He's out of Princeton, and John Hawks, who's out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's not in the cool crowd of Augustin Fuentes. But the three of them were really the major players on this, and the community was like, before the actual peer-reviewed paper gave thumbs down, said these are three credible people, and why don't we just give them a chance? Well, what everybody learned at that time is that there was a book coming out, Cave of Bones, from Lee Berger, and they had a Netflix documentary coming out. And everybody also learned out that they previously had a paper into one of the major journals, and after 7 or 8 months, it didn't pass muster. So they'd actually been through this peer. It turns out they had been through the so-called peer-reviewed process. And from my perspective, peer review doesn't make it true. I've had papers published in peer-reviewed journals, and it doesn't make it more right or more wrong.
Right.
It just there's alternative. And I've been asked to look at peer-reviewed papers in the past. So Netflix, Cave of Bones, is what it is, and it's part of an unknown series. And in that series, there's killer robots. There's you remember Hawass, who's always battling Graham Hancock?
Right.
He's got an episode, and I think that it's really telling of Hawass in this, that he's a turd. The guy's a turd. he's contrasted with a Egyptologist who is not about ego, and Hawass is completely about ego. And they compare and contrast the two. In the end, the guy who has some dignity, he makes the big find and he passes the name on to one of his team members. And in the end, Hawass finds nothing. He just finds dirt. So I recommend people watch. It's called The Lost Pyramid. Hawass is the antagonist of shorts. And
Right.
the guy's the protagonist. So it's more opera than it is documentary. It's more pixie dust than it is science. Okay, it's the stuff that social media dreams are made of. Because what happened with both this Cave of Bones and the Lost Pyramid is people got on social media to give their opinion one way or the other.
Right, of course.
And that's what Netflix was looking for. They weren't looking for something that was proven. Everybody's, the books are closed and everybody's ready to move on. They're looking for the characters themselves. And Lee Berger is definitely a character. There's no question. Highly intelligent guy, but he's a character. So it was mid-July, released on Netflix. I watched it twice, and I had kind of a different perspective on this thing, in that as soon as those pre-peer-reviewed papers came out, I started looking at the images, and the images had a different sense to me than they did to most people. And I didn't care that they were small brain people.
Right. Yeah. I know they made a big
Naledi.
deal about that. Yeah.
It was big. Yeah. That I didn't care about that. What I cared about is I had actually seen these images before. Actually, I'd seen one of the images before. And I'm one of the few people in the world had actually seen that image before.
Wow.
And that's where the story gets really interesting. But let's look at Rising Star Cave. It's in South Africa. It's so-called Cradle of Humankind. It's on the southeast side of Africa. South Africa is a pretty big place. And something interesting about Lee Berger is that when he first sent people out to look for potential sites. And the people that first went into this cave took a lot of good photographs, and they came back with fossilized bones. They didn't know who they were at the time, but they were broken. Therefore, from the time they were fossilized, which can't tell you how long it takes to be fossilized, and these are upper level surface ones, so presumably they were the last Homo naledi that went in there.
Right.
Someone had been in there. Now Berger has changed his story since 2020 when he said that, and he actually had it in his previous book, Almost Human. Now he says that the only people we know were in the cave are the ones that are on our team. Well, that's bullshit, because he said back in 2020 that the bones are broken, somebody else was in there, and he doesn't know who. And I would say that that's somebody in that is modern, anatomically modern humans, that meaning us. But I don't think it was you and me in the last dozens or even hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Okay. So this to kind of put this cave system in perspective, is the chamber where we're finding the engravings and try to find these Homo naledi fossilized bones. They're deep in there. They're like really deep in there, and it's going to take you 40 minutes to get from the cave entrance down into this Naledi chamber. It's super tight. I've got like the shoulders like a linebacker. I never would fit in there. So they recruited.
I know. I was going to say, I can understand the people or human. What is it? Homo
Naledi.
Naledi. So they were pretty small. I can understand how they could, but I was like, there's no way I could get my body in there.
Yeah, there's no way. You and I, you're not only you're a really good-looking guy, you got huge shoulders too for people out there in audio podcast.
I'm 6 feet 215.
So there's a huge drop that goes down there into the final chamber. It's really dangerous. Lee Berger lost like a whole bunch of pounds to be able to shimmy down there. But it's a dangerous place to get down. It's not where people are just walking by, and that's kind of part of their narrative is, well, maybe modern humans did just get down in there. Well, there's two panels. They had two identified panels in their so-called pre-peer-reviewed papers. It's kind of a joke, and the question then became, were these panels by Homo naledi, who were the only fossilized bones down there, only bones remnants down there? There was also an owl bone. I think it was a leg or wing of an owl, and it wasn't by the owl, right? Okay, we'll put that one out. But so the question was, did they make these engravings? And they thought they were abstract art. That's what, and they didn't actually. They had been in the caves from 2012 to 2021 or 2022, and people had been walking back and forth these gravings the whole time. And it wasn't until Berger, when he lost a bunch of weight and he went in on the last day, that he saw them. Okay, so this wasn't something that people were looking for. It was something Berger stumbled upon because he was fresh eyes going down into the cave. I mean, after all those years, they see these engravings.
Right.
Well, Berger's has he has a predisposition when he looks at these things, and his disposition connects to a guy named Brian Murawski or something Murkowski, who wrote a book called The Immortality Key. And Brian's thesis is that ancient religions were based on psychedelic drugs. Okay? And he means ancient, the Greeks, the Romans.
Right,
Christians,
exactly right.
And I have absolutely, if they are, actually he said that they put the drugs in the alcohol, psychedelic drugs. If they did or they didn't, makes no difference to me. I could care less. I live in Oregon, and I voted for the decriminalization of everything. And everything was decriminalized, and people, there's lots of shrooms going around. And so I could care less about one way or the other in terms of the political debate. But I think that so Lee Berger's following Brian's deal, and Brian, guess who Brian who's Brian singularly cites as the source for hallucinogenics in art. Give me a name. Graham Hancock.
Oh,
okay.
wow.
So,
I would have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Hancock cites Terence McKenna, but Brian doesn't cite Terence McKenna. So what we're really looking at here is and wherever you stand, Graham Hancock is totally relevant. Okay? Lee Berger is standing on the shoulders of Graham Hancock in this.
That's great.
It. And whereas he had no evidence of anything, and he was saying this is abstract art by Homo Naledi because they buried their dead there, and it was how they found their way into the afterlife. They're supernatural through hallucinogenics. I mean, that's the underlying story. He doesn't say that in his books, and he doesn't say in the Netflix documentary, but he says that he gives all the dots that draw to this in his podcast interviews. So I had said that I was one of the few people in the world that had actually seen a duplicate of this. Well, that's sort of, we'll call that a half truth. That's a half truth, because about 2013, 14, there was an etching in a cave in Gibraltar that's dated to about 36,000 years ago. The archaeologist said 39. We'll get that to a minute. And all the images that went out to the world had this dirt-covered version of the engraving. And what the archaeologists who work on the cave in Gibraltar, the British archaeologists, by the way, the British colony or protectorate or whatever they use these days, they said that there was no evidence of Homo sapiens in the cave system. Therefore, it must be Neanderthals, which they did have evidence in the cave system. And at that time, there was there was some debate over. There's a lot of debate over the Neanderthal thing. But anyway, I had bought from the photographer a clean version of the image, so I'm studying what it looks like under the dirt. And by the way, the Homo Naledi, these cave of bones engravings, they're also looking at them dirt covered. Just kind of put that in perspective. So they're looking at dirt covered. Whereas I had been studying since 2014 or so this Gibraltar image, and at the so-called Gorham's cave. And I've done like lots of presentations. We never got there in your program. I've done a lot of work on it. Okay, but there's a huge difference between what you can see with this Gibraltar image that's dirt covered and when it's clean. Major difference between the two. And this Gorham etching image, it's actually scaled to the size of two hands. So if you put your palms one over the other, you would it's scaled with two hands, and that's the exact same size as the engraving cave, the gravings in this Rising Star cave in South Africa. Interesting. So they actually are the same size. Okay. So the Rising Star team, they said, hey, these used to look the same, but they don't really look the same, and they can't be the same because Neanderthals made it in Gibraltar, and only Homo Naledi had been in our cave. Therefore, it have to be Homo Naledi. Okay. And that was their narrative. Well, the Neanderthal in Gibraltar cave was really critiqued, and um, it, everybody was not on board with this thing, and this is the reason why. And this is not a slam against archaeology or anything like that, but there's layers in the bottom of this cave. Okay, and they had said layers down about 40 to 45,000 years ago had a Neanderthal objects, um, and so that was pretty cool, and it was somewhere around there. But what they did is that this engraving actually sits on like a stone table. It's actually engraved into the table. They said that the sediments deep down in the cave went up the wall and landed on the top of this. So they went with 39,000 years ago. But if you really look at the levels of the sediments in this cave, it's about 35,000 years ago. Okay. But what their narrative was at that time is that there were Homo sapiens. I'm sorry, Neanderthals. There was no modern Homo sapiens like us in Europe until about 41,000 years ago.
Wow.
And so they pushed their dating on the sediments. They pushed it to the limit, and they said 39,000. We're good. And because we have no evidence of Homo sapiens here. But since then, the dating's been pushed back to 54,000 years ago. And so this whole Neanderthal thing in this Gibraltar cave it's nonsensical. So I'm going to tell you what Lee Berger did. He did it on the Cave of Bones on Netflix documentary. He says, well, that must be 60,000 years ago because now we're pushing Neanderthals to 60,000 years ago. But the original study said 39, and they were already pushing the limits. There was never any evidence that the original stuff was 60,000 years ago. And so Lee Berger is putting kind of nonsense on top of pushing nonsense on top of nonsense. And I'm saying that from I have nothing against Lee Berger, but it's the fact of the matter is that's what he did. So the question mark became of this Cave of Bones, the Rising Star Cave in South Africa. How old is it? How old is this stuff? Well, they never dated it, and there are ways to date this that they didn't pursue, and I have no opinion why they did or that they didn't do it. But they didn't do it. So then we have this question. I mean, this is like you've had a lot of interesting people in your program. They've talked about migrations around the world 12,000 years ago, and the whole you've had it. So if there's a connection between this Gibraltar cave and the South African cave, it's a long freaking way. Okay? And
yes.
Using Google Maps, they run 6 miles per hour. It's 2,000 hours, which is a long freaking way to go across Africa down and through Gibraltar into South Africa, and that's how you and I would perceive that. But I'm going to tell you a story about. I wrote a book called Biological Time back in 2004, and maybe about 2007 or 2008, I got an email from a woman named Fiona Campbell, and she said that she loved my book and she was going to live it for a year. And honest to God, I thought she was a kook. I mean, honestly, why would you? This is a book about the biology of plants and animals and how you time them through the light and dark signals of the sun and the moon. Thought she was completely nuts. Okay. And then she emails me back a year later and she says that she did it. Okay, she did it, and she wrote a book about it. And she said all kinds of things that it became like a nature awareness program for her, that she learned when to go catch fish based on the tides, the sun and the moon. She learned when you could find, terrestrial animals based on the same. And so she used a clock or calendars that indigenous people have been using all around the world since time immemorial, and she applied that to Scotland where she was living. So that at that point, I actually looked up Fiona Campbell and puts the narrative of this migration. Fiona Campbell was the first woman to walk around all continents around the world.
Wow.
And so if you put that into perspective, she was when she did that, she was probably like late 20s. You look at her picture, she's a really good looking woman, but late 20s, and she walks around the world, and she had different partners throughout that process. So if Fiona Campbell can walk around the world, and granted she took a few ships here and there, why couldn't somebody or people migrate between Gibraltar and South Africa? I mean, you kind of put it into that perspective. I mean, you and I, we may be a little lazy to do that, but Fiona did it. Saharan Tuareg, these so-called blue people of the Sahara, which are, and I'm not going to go into the whole like racial stuff, but they're Caucasoid. They're actually Caucasoid people, and there's some questions about where they come from. Well, the Saharan Tuareg, they migrate around the Saharan desert over 1,000 miles a year on foot. Okay, so this is not inconceivable for people to be able to walk from Gibraltar to South Africa. People who, they've learned other ways to live.
Mm-hmm.
When I looked at this cave, these images, the Cave of Bones, the Rising Star Cave, the first thing that jumped out at me was there's a bear in it. There's a bear. I mean, that was like, it just jumped right away. There's a standing bear. And then right after that, I saw the profile head of another bear, which is really cool. So this became really significant because 300,000 years ago, there were no bears in South Africa. And they've been for like, I mean, and they haven't been any bears in South Africa since then. So the artist, if those are bears, the artist must have been to Eurasia.
Yeah, from somewhere else.
Okay. Or now there's bears in Morocco. Let's say in ancient times there were bears in Morocco and North Africa. So it's but you're talking hours difference between Eurasia and West North Africa. So you're in the same part of the world. But this artist had been a lot far north than South Africa in a time in our distant past. And then there's another panel there. Actually, there's another bear, and this bear is sitting. It's got its neck stretched up, and a really cool bear. And what they did for both these bears, they built them into the natural contours of the rock face. So they are in fact reliefs, and they use some characteristics. They preserve some of the characteristics for the characters. Well, it just so happens that Gorham's Etching in Gibraltar also has a lot of bears. And when you clean off the image, right, and you study it closely, there's etched, and there's sets of bears, and one set of bears is a mother bear, and she's got her right paw outstretched, and she's pulling back two cubs. And then when you turn it to the side, you turn your head a little bit to the side, you can see the bears climbing a tree. Because what mother bears do, they teach their juveniles to climb a tree for safety. And there comes I'm not sure how much you know about bears, but what mother bears do is at a point that they want to when the cubs get a little, too old for them, and she chases them up to be in the tree, and then she runs away. So when someone says they're a mother bear, strong mother bear, that also means she's got to get rid of it. Let the kids go at some time. Well, there's also we talked in the first program. We talked about this Gallery of Dis, the El Castillo cave in northern Spain,
right. And
it also has bears, and it has a mother bear looking at her cubs climb trees, and that goes back to this. It's psychologically it's letting go of your kids. That's what it is. Well, also on this Rising Star cave, it jumped right after that. Jumped out at me. There's elephants, and they're African elephants because they have flat heads. And most of the zoos you go to in the United States, they have Asian elephants which have a humped head. Okay, so African elephants, and have flat heads. And the African elephant tends to be more docile than an Asian elephant, which is part of the reason why we have them in the zoo. So anyway, there's a mother. There's a mother. There could be three. There could be three elephants, but there's clearly two, and one is a juvenile. The other one appears to be the mother, and she's kind of like nuzzling up against them. And on the Gallery of Dis, the one in northern Spain, in the first program we did, there's two African elephants. We know they're African again because they have their the heads are flat, and
right.
There's one has its trunk down, the other one has its trunk up. So we're seeing two like emotional states. One is trunk down is drinking, kind of relaxed. The trunk up is, and the ear up is highly distressed. Well, on this Gorham Etching in Gibraltar, again, we have elephants, and we have a juvenile, and two older elephants, and we have tusks, and they also have flat heads. But it's really not that far from Gibraltar. It's a 3-hour swim to where they would have seen flat-headed elephants because they were in northern Africa. And then this is where the story kind of gets really intriguing, and for me at least, anyway. So back when 2014, 15, when I was working on this Gallery of Dis in northern Spain, I was working with a wildlife biologist, and his name is George Schaller. And George is in the world. He's the foremost living wildlife biologist, and he was the mentor of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey and many others. So if George says something is, it is, and no one's going to argue about it because he was an illustrator and he spent more time in the field than anybody else, and he knew his stuff. And we saw a giraffe on the gallery of discs. I identified the giraffe and then a juvenile nuzzling up against it, and George said that's a Maasai giraffe. And well, the Maasai giraffes are in South Africa. There are giraffes in Western North Africa back then, as well as there are today, but they're not Maasai giraffes. And so we kind of scratched our heads on this one, and we said, okay, well maybe they had migrated north at some period in the past, and people had seen them, and that who knows, right? I mean, tens of thousands of years, a lot could happen. Well, there's also a giraffe on this Rising Star Cave of Bones panel, one of the panels, but it makes sense because there are a lot of giraffes. There were giraffes then, there are giraffes now. But but what George was right. George was right. On the gallery of discs, it was a Maasai giraffe. That's what he was right about. And well, there's a number. There's actually 2 panels of giraffes, and they both have the mother and the juvenile, and they cross the heads, and they're really cool. And on one of them, the bear that I talked about earlier, the sitting bear, overlaps with the mother giraffe, so it's kind of superimposed on top of it, and they use some of the same lines, which is like super cool.
Is it like using canvas twice?
They're using the canvas twice, so that the long muzzle of the head and muzzle of the mother giraffe, 2/3 of that becomes the head of this sitting bear. And wow. It's like, so it's like super cool. I mean, these people just weren't pecking at the rocks.
Right.
These people were highly intelligent. This is and so it's like, and at the bottom of the same panel, it looks like a whale. Okay, I'm just put that out there. It looks like a whale. It looks like a sperm whale, and I thought that was pretty cool too. Well, as I said, on this gallery of discs in northern Spain, we also have the giraffes, and George and I talked about, and you have the mother giraffe, whose muzzle is on top of the juvenile, who's wrapped around her neck, so it's a protective or sleeping type of mode. And we really struggled with that one. And what's also really cool about this one is that the gallery of discs is named after the discs that stream across it, and the artists used the disc to create the molten pattern on the neck of the giraffes. And in this Gorham cave, we also have 2 giraffes. Again, these nuzzled up against each other. And well, those 2 giraffes on the Gorham etching are directionally on the panels in the exact same way they are in the Rising Star South African cave. Okay, and so we talked, there's these hashtag lines on both the South African cave and the Gibraltar cave, and if you turn it if they're in the same, they are in the same direction, and they're in the same lines that you could have for your fingers. So it's like super cool. And on another panel in the Rising Star cave, we have a whale, presumably a sperm whale, and on the other end of it we have a shark. And the sperm whale, you have to realize that the sperm whale, but the shark, well, of course that's a shark. I mean, like, anybody can figure that out. Well, on the gallery of discs in northern Spain, we have a breaching humpback whale. Okay, and that is directionally opposite, or they overlap directionally opposite with the bottlenose dolphin. So we have the whale, and we have another, let's say, the marine animals, but called a fish, right? Okay. In like caveman terms. So you have one, they're back to back. And on the Gibraltar cave, Gorham's cave, we have a flying fish back to back with a whale. It's not as clear, but it's the whale's not as clear, but the flying fish is good. And what's interesting about all these animals, except for the shark, is they all jump out of the water. Okay, they all breach in certain ways, and the flying fish actually sort of flies. Okay, and on this Rising Star cave, we also have a bird emerging from an egg, which is telling us a time of year. And I haven't been able to identify what the bird is, but once that is resolved, I'll know the time of year that they predicted this part of the etching. And there's another bird that's sort of standing. It's really cool. I don't know what this bird is. I really need to, if somebody on your program is in South Africa and hangs out with ornithologists and birder types, reach out to me. I'd love to connect with somebody who can identify these. But the second one is clearly a standing bird, which is interesting because on the gallery of disc we find a fledgling golden eagle, and fledgling is telling us what time of year it is, which is mid-June, based on its height and the down that's still on its flanks. So these birds are telling us about time and space. They're just not birds hatching. And what's really cool about the one on the gallery of disc is that the bird stands on the shoulder of the man, and so it creates his like hairline, which is like super cool. And on the gallery just there's an ostrich, and I don't know if either of those rising star cave images are ostriches, but we have ostriches, and so it's a thing to have birds on a panel. Now, something interesting about this rising star cave abode in South African panel is that there's a mare horse and her foal. So there were no horses in South Africa. Okay, they were equine or equids, which would have been the zebra. But these two, the mare and the foal, don't look like zebras. They totally don't look like zebras. Therefore, the artist would have have gone to at least Eurasia to have seen a horse. Must have gone to Eurasia, which is so we're going to that same thought pattern of the bear.
Right.
The bears is they had to go someplace, and they did not see this close to home. And on the gallery of discs, we also have the mare, and she's speckled with the disc, which is really cool. And on the Gorham's cave in Gibraltar, we have a mare as well. And it's fascinating image that's also built into the hashtag sort of thing as well. And this was not seen by the archaeologists who did the original work on this panel, because they made all the decisions before they cleaned it off, which is exactly what the Cave of Bones people did. And something interesting about this Gorham cave, there's actually a second horse on it, and the second horse is kind of a little weird, I'm going to tell you. Well, that second horse is actually built on Paradoia in a nearby mountain, Mohassen. Mohassen is the tallest mountain on the Iberian Peninsula. So what the artist did for the Gibraltar Gorham etching is that they found Paradoia in the mountain, this high mountain, and that's where they found their hashtag and the lines. And they found this horse. This kind of looks like a horse.
It almost looks like a dinosaur.
Yeah, well, okay, but clearly, you see the shape, the same shape goes from one to the other from the mountain. And that's and horses are important to them. But it's clear that Mohassen was where they found their inspiration. And so somebody put their hand up the mountain, and they measured their fingers, and they took it back into the cave to find that shape. Okay. Well, there's some other cool images on this rising star cave in South Africa, Cave of Bones. There's a honey badger, and to be honest, I didn't know what a honey badger was. So I'd seen this animal when I was looking at the panel, or the images of the panel, and I said, this is an unknown animal. I just don't know what this thing is. I have like no idea.
I've heard of honey boo boo, not honey badger.
Honey badger, yeah, it's an African Asian animal. I had no idea. And what's distinctive about it has these really long like fingers that are like, I don't know, clawed fingers, like really long. So it's an enormously dangerous animal. And in the mouth of the honey badger on the Rising Star Cave it's holding its juvenile. And so that's like real. So we have this mother juvenile scene in the same way we have the giraffes and the mare and the foal. This is not about these. They're not hunting these animals. This is about learning skills from these animals. But it's really cool. And how I figured it out sort of is that I was on Facebook, and I subscribed to a few South African groups where they show images of animals, and I just saw this honey badger. That's it. I mean that's it. And then it went back into Shutterstock to find the right image. What's the right pose of this? How this thing looks, so that I could draw. And I outlined it. I traced it. And there's a pig on one of these panels too. Pig-like animal. I don't know what kind of pig it is, but it's a pig. I can which is really cool. And which there's also a hare, so like rabbit hair, right? And it's a hare because in fact it's huge. It's the size, just about the size of the bear head and profile, and it actually overlaps with the bear head and profile. It's a huge hare. And how you know it's a hare is that the hare has a very narrow head, whereas the rabbit has kind of a heavier face, under chin, and the hare has longer, thinner ears. And so I couldn't tell you what kind of a hare it is, but it's clearly sleeping. It's a sleeping hare, which must be part of their narrative, which I don't know what the narrative, but it's really cool that you got this hare. So then the question then becomes, who made these freaking things? I mean,
Right.
is it Homo naledi or is it modern humans? Well, so going back, it is identical. The characters in the same order are almost identical to the ones on the Gorham etching in Gibraltar. So they knew each other. Maybe they were brothers. Maybe they weren't cousins, but they had some connection, and both of them had to be to either place, into each other's place. So it wasn't until Netflix thing came out that I really had some good views of the panels, because when these guys took and the Lee Berger and friends, they took their images. They were just trying to. It's abstract art. We're good. Go back to the mortality keys,
Right.
Hancock Supernatural, Terence McKenna, the whole thing. They were kind of like good with that. That was so, and they never looked at it, and so they didn't have different comparison images or different perspectives in their pre-peer reviewed papers. So Netflix comes along, and the cameraman's like panning across the wall, and so the first time I could see things like I hadn't seen before, and like what just like jumped out at me was there's a face there. There's absolutely a face there, and Homo naledi had like a chimp-like face, and had these big his eyebrows or his brow there was like overreaching, and this character he doesn't look as good as you, but he's not that far distant from you, right? Okay.
Right.
And so he obviously has a Homo sapiens nose. Okay.
Well, they definitely had some intelligence. I mean, to be able to.
So this guy's Homo sapiens. That's my point. This guy is totally Homo sapiens.
Right.
Because we can see a picture of him, and
Yeah.
he's not Homo naledi. We can see the picture of this character. We can see his chin. We can see his mouth. We can see his nose. We can see two eyes. The guy's anatomically modern human. He's Homo sapiens. We are the heirs to his kingdom, we could say. But clearly, the guys. So not only do we have a picture of the man, okay, we have the comparable images in two other caves in Europe, and we have animals that weren't in South Africa and animals that weren't in Europe on each other's caves walls. So they had been there. And going back to my friend Fiona Campbell, she can walk around the world. These people could walk 2,000 hours from Europe.
Wow.
And so kind of one could compare the Gibraltar image, and as I said, they're just not the same characters in the same order, but they're the same except for one bear. They're the same orientations in the same order. So statistically, if you have 6 animals on a panel in 2 caves that are not just the same order but the same orientations relative to each other, it's statistically it's impossible. It's just totally freaking impossible. And they're both in these hashtags. They're both in the same hashtags, and they use those hashtags, I would say, to scale it. So going back to Lee Berger, he had said in his previous book and in an interview, someone had been in that chamber and stepped on some of this material, meaning the fossils of the Homo naledi fossils, and I didn't know how recently. Well, it was people between after the fossilization of the last Homo naledi that were in there, and before the arrival of his team. Because we can see, and I'm going with 36,000 years ago. 36,000 years ago, people. I'm not going to tell you that people were migrating between the two places. I'm going to tell you that these people, it was one continental community. And I'm going to put Gibraltar. I'm going to add Gibraltar to Africa. It's right there. And so Iberian and African community, that these people were communicating across. They were trading across. They were making art across. They were hunting animals, and these people knew each other. Sort of like Native Americans on the Great Plains. Is on the south part of the Great Plains, people were communicating with the Lakota and the north part of the plains because they had developed a sign language, Native American sign language, that they could do that. So it is a longer distance between Arizona, to Wyoming than it is from Gibraltar to South Africa. But it's still long distance that people had to develop a common language that they could communicate with each other. So I would say that these people were um, they were part of the same greater community. Now you've had people on the program, and they've talked about the Atlantis narrative,
Oh yeah, for sure.
and and you have lots of, we did that in our last program, and I had a different narrative just about everybody else, and they say, Plato says that there was a continent, it was this vast continent, and people that expanded across Africa. Okay, well, let's buy that. I'll buy that story. But Plato wasn't looking at a story from 12,000 years ago. He was looking, his sources had images from 34,000 years ago that they saw Maasai giraffes in caves in Gibraltar and in northern Spain. And they knew they were Maasai giraffes in the same way as George Schaller did. And so from that concept, they presumed that there were people in the past. They didn't know how far in the past. It wasn't 12,000 years ago. It was 36,000 years ago. But they didn't know how far back in the past. So they just, they put a date past what they thought was sort of like what was modern to them, right? Because obviously the ancient us, but what was modern to them. They put a date back in time 12,000 years ago because they just didn't know what the date was. But so there in fact there were people moving or living between. It was a great civilization. I wouldn't use the word per se. It's because civilization is I'm more civilized than that person, right? Got it. But it's clearly people they're highly intelligent. In the previous programs, we talked about astronomy. They certainly had navigation because they couldn't do this. They had great artwork and culture, mythology, because these characters that they're talking about, they're just not throwing animals on the wall of a cave or images of them. They have biological narratives, which would be mythological, how they would express them. And this was their the hero's journey story. This was their biology book, and another program, different time, we can actually go through the astronomy of it, but that's a different program and a different time. So people, this Atlantis narrative it's sort of true and it's sort of not true. It's true from the perspective that a long, long time ago, 36,000 years ago, people were connected, and that let's call it the western side of Africa was connected culturally to the Iberian Peninsula, and that makes pretty like Native Americans across the Great Plains. So kind of going back, we're going to go step back to 2021, and in that year, there's a major story. Indonesia had surfaced cave art at 45,000 years ago. 45,000 years ago. It was a pig. Actually, it was a hand. It was a hand. It was next to a pig. And they dated it. It's reliably dated. No one questioned about it. And the oldest cave art in Iberian Peninsula was at 40,000 years ago. So that became older. But in fact, there could be older cave art in Iberian Peninsula. We just haven't dated it. Okay. So the question then became, the question surfaced and was quickly dismissed, that the European cave artists were connected to the Indonesian cave artists. Because that's a long freaking way to go, right?
Right.
And so people said that maybe there was a common culture in Africa that people had gone in two different directions. Okay. It's interesting perspective, and we can all agree, silently or quiet, raise your hands on if you're in audio world. We can agree that Iberian Peninsula, now Spain, South Africa, and Indonesia are a long way apart. We can, but if you go back to the Fiona Campbell story, she walked around the world. If you look at the Saharan Tuareg, they migrate over 1,000 miles a year on foot. This isn't outside of the realm of possibility. And so people in Indonesia possibly had moved out and didn't come back, because what we don't see in Indonesian cave art, we don't see, at least that old, we don't see the same images that are duplicated between Iberian Peninsula and South Africa. So we're not seeing giraffes in Indonesian cave art. So people had left, people in Indonesia had left sometime and apparently didn't return, whereas the people in Iberian Peninsula and South Africa were still connected. They'd been back and forth with each other, as we can see in their art. And so when people out there in the world are saying, you know, all these things can happen and blank, 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 and well, we have it in the art, we have it in the dating of the art. And so, you know what, I think I started the program off that I said that I'm not in the mainstream. Okay? I go to the conferences, I give my narrative, and I get invited back to the conferences and to scientific society talks and things like that. And I go on podcasts, and I tell, you know, I don't throw anybody in the bus. It's not my stick. But I do, and I don't do the us versus them sort of thing. But what I do is I give a narrative that's fully supported, that is completely different than anybody else you can have on the program. And so in this story, this narrative is people left to go to Indonesia, and people going back and forth to South Africa. So we can go, how come these guys didn't see this stuff? Okay. Well, in the case of the Gibraltar, when they had made the decision right away that it was Neanderthal, they never studied the images, and I bought it from them. And in the case of the South African team, they didn't even look at it. They didn't look at it because they already had the narrative based on Brian's book, which is based on Hancock Supernatural.
Right.
They never looked at it. Because that was their. Well, there's some qualification to see these sort of images, and we all see the world differently. Some people look at the clouds and they see bunnies. Some people look at the clouds and they see nothing, because we're wired differently. It's a thing, and you can actually take a test. You can take a test with psychologists that how quickly you can see sort of embedded images. It's called an embedded figures test, and you can go online and you can see all kinds of like tests. You know, there's one out there with an elephant. It's got a bunch of animals.
Rat,
a few animals obviously
cat,
within its
dog,
body, cat, dog, but when someone gives you the solution, you say, well, there's actually a lot more than I saw right away. Well, there's people who can see these things more quickly than others, but in the end, everybody sees them once they're outlined. There's a Canadian artist called Bev Doolittle, and people go online, you see her stuff. Everybody's already seen her stuff out there. You just may not remember it. And what Bev does is she does presumably watercolors that has overlapping of animals, like horses, for example, and they might be like brown patches of the horse with white body and on a brown background and snow. And you have to kind of figure out how many horses in there, and it's kind of tricky. But if you give it a few minutes, you'll figure it out. So this is like what people do. I mean, some people are very good at doing this. Some people are not as good as.
That's pretty cool.
And that's it's about seeing the trees. We say you got to see the forest through the trees, but really in this case it's about seeing the trees through the forest. It's about seeing details that most people pass by. And these cave artists who made the art, not everybody in the clan or in the tribe, they had an ability to see the trees through the forest, that they can have overlapping a bear and a giraffe to create incredible images. And that was their stick. And so these we call, there's all kinds of diversity out there, right? Well, neurodiversity is how people look at this from a scientific perspective, because there's a range. And I'm going to tell you, people who are like high on the math range are the other end of the spectrum, who are high on seeing the trees of the forest. The trees of the forest people are your artists. Your artists that can, look at a landscape or look at a cat and just go home and sketch the same landscape. Right. We know people that do that, right? We know them, right?
I do.
And we also know people. Sorry.
No, I said I do too. Yeah, I know some people that can do that.
Yeah, because so there are neurological differences between people, and there's people that they can look at a tree and they can figure out the math of how tall that tree is by measuring off a blade of grass on the ground. It's who people are. Okay, we're just all different. And what I did, a lot of this discussion, I actually have images on my webpage beforeorion.com, and there's a blog. It's called the Rising Star Cave Engravings, the Underworld, because we've talked about the underworld in this, and I'm going to have follow-up blogs that have the terrestrial plane, because we didn't talk about that today, and as well as the sky world, which would be the stars. And so maybe sometime in the future we can actually revisit that.
I would love that.
So people,
we have about 5 minutes left, and I'd love to invite people to go to Bernie's website beforeorion.com and check out more. But we definitely will have Bernie back again, because there's so much to discuss.
Yeah, what's actually interesting about this is we unintentionally threw Netflix Cave of Bones completely under the bus. Because what it wasn't like we're against Lee Berger or its team or South Africans or whatever you want. So it's not what we're coming forward. The truth be told.
Hey, see,
and we brought the truth forwards through the narrative of images that we find both South Africa, images of animals on 2 continents that didn't overlap, and we threw a Neanderthal thing under the bus too. But we challenged this narrative, that CNN, ABC, and everywhere else through evidence itself.
right?
And at the same time, we closed the gap perhaps between this Plato's version of Atlantis, and that there was a civilization. There were people across both continents, and the ancient people had seen the giraffes, and they knew that was a Maasai giraffe. Therefore, those people in Europe had been to South Africa. And I tell you, when this Cave of Bones stuff came out, totally blew me away, because I never imagined that they would go. I thought they're going into West North Africa. I never imagined that the connection was to South Africa.
It's amazing. I find every time I hear something in the news or an article about a new species found, or like you said, a new cave art or a new skull, and it shows you the significance of human beings or whatever species you are, that how of an impact you can make, even though when you at the time they were so irrelevant. There probably wasn't that many species of any type of Homo sapiens or Homo whatever you are at that time, but they're still making an impact in 2023 and throwing us for a loop, and their art is making millions of people excited and to know the past. So I love when people like you bring this to our attention, that we would not even talk about in an everyday conversation.
Absolutely. So people, if you're out there, whether you're YouTube or Audio Land, and you repost this, you got to, hashtag Truth Be Told?
Hashtag Truth Be Told.
Hashtag Cave of Bones.
Cave of Bones.
We want the people in South Africa to recognize that in Hollywood, Tinseltown, La La Land, we're watching. We're watching, and
get it right.
Truth Be Told, hashtag Cave of Bones. So put the message out there that we're watching.
We are watching, and we watch you too, Bernie. We appreciate you doing everything you do and bringing us amazing content and keeping us up to date on these subjects that, like you said, we normally would not even probably hear in an everyday conversation. So thank you so much for being on Truth Be Told one more time, and I know you'll be back for many more. And I hope you have a great Labor Day weekend coming up in a week or so.
Thank you very much, Tony. Let's do it again.
Let's do it again. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And make sure you tune in for all. We are now Club Paranormal group, and we are Truth Be Told and Truth Be Told Transformation, Men Report, Truth Be Told Espanol, and coming soon, Paranormal Pals. We have so many different podcasts under our brand, and so excited to have you guys part of it. And just keep us coming with the request of people you want to see on Truth Be Told, because you mean a lot to us. So, but until next time, I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Again, thanks Bernie Taylor for being on the show. Until next time, take care, guys. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media. Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio. Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.